A 23-year-old RAF gunner walks into a dark loading bay behind a row of shops in Suffolk and is never seen again. No confirmed CCTV footage shows him leaving. No witnesses ever come forward to say they saw where he went. His phone would later travel across the countryside in the early hours of the morning towards a landfill site. At first, police feared the worst. Had Corrie McKeague been abducted, attacked, picked up by someone hiding in the shadows of Bury St Edmunds? Or had a young man somehow vanished voluntarily, without trace? For months the case gripped Britain. National news channels led with the mystery of the missing RAF airman. Online forums filled with theories. Former detectives questioned the investigation publicly, and every new development seemed to raise more questions than answers. Then investigators announced a theory so disturbing, so bizarre, that many people refused to believe it. Police began to suspect that Corrie McKeague had never left the loading bay at all. Instead, they believed he had entered a commercial waste bin after a night of drinking and had been unknowingly crushed inside a refuse lorry before being carried to landfill. No body was ever recovered. No final proof was ever found. And even now, years later, many people still question exactly what happened during Corrie McKeague's final hours. Because sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are not hidden in remote forests or abandoned buildings, but in ordinary places people walk past every single day. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm your host, Matt. You can find us on all the socials at What They Hide Pod, and if you'd like to support the show directly, you can also find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. A huge thank you to everybody continuing to listen, follow, share the episodes and send messages in. The podcast is continuing to grow every week because of you. Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of death, missing persons, traumatic injuries and themes some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Tonight, we examine one of Britain's strangest modern disappearances, the case of Corrie McKeague, a young RAF gunner who vanished after a night out in Suffolk, before an investigation slowly uncovered a theory almost nobody expected. This is the story of Corrie McKeague. In September 2016, 23-year-old Corrie McKeague was serving with the Royal Air Force Regiment at RAF Honington in Suffolk. Friends described him as sociable, funny, energetic and spontaneous. His mother later described him as a social hand grenade, someone who could walk into almost any room and immediately become the centre of attention. Originally from Scotland, Corrie had adapted quickly to military life, but like many young servicemen stationed away from home, weekends often revolved around nights out with friends. On Friday, the 23rd of September 2016, Corrie travelled into the nearby town of Bury St Edmunds for an evening drinking with friends. At first, nothing about the night appeared unusual. The town centre was busy, bars were crowded, music spilled out onto the streets as groups moved between pubs and late-night food shops. CCTV would later capture Corrie throughout parts of the evening. He appeared heavily intoxicated by the early hours of the morning, but still mobile and interacting normally with people around him. At some point during the night, Corrie became separated from the group he had been with. Investigators would later piece together his movements using CCTV cameras spread across the town centre. The footage showed him wandering alone through Bury St Edmunds shortly after 3 a.m. Then, at approximately 3:25 a.m, Corrie walked into an area known locally as the Horseshoe. The Horseshoe was not some isolated alley hidden far outside town. It was a service and loading area behind shops, including Greggs and Iceland. A place used for commercial deliveries and waste collection. An ordinary space most people would barely notice during daylight hours. But during the early morning darkness, the area was quiet, almost deserted, and surrounded by industrial waste containers. CCTV captured Corrie entering the loading bay, but according to investigators, no confirmed footage ever captured him leaving it. At first, nobody realised the significance of that detail. Friends assumed Corrie had gone home with somebody, perhaps fallen asleep elsewhere after drinking too much, maybe missed calls because his phone battery had died. But as the hours passed, concern began to grow. Corrie failed to return to RAF Honington. His family could not contact him. Friends became increasingly alarmed, and before long, a missing person investigation was underway. At the beginning, police treated the case as a vulnerable missing person inquiry. There was no obvious crime scene, no evidence of violence, no witnesses reporting an assault. But there was also something deeply unsettling about the circumstances. Because in a town centre covered by CCTV cameras, a young man had apparently vanished into thin air. As news coverage spread across Britain, theories began appearing almost immediately. Some believed Corrie had been attacked. Others thought he may have accepted a lift from a stranger. Some online discussions even suggested military conspiracies or deliberate disappearance. And investigators themselves were still trying to understand what they were dealing with. Because at that stage, police had not yet reached the conclusion that would later define the entire case. Instead, they were still asking the same question as everyone else. What happened after Corrie McKeague entered the Horseshoe? As Saturday morning turned into Saturday afternoon, the disappearance of Corrie McKeague began attracting wider attention across Suffolk. At first, there was still hope that Corrie would simply reappear. Missing person cases involving young adults after nights of heavy drinking are not uncommon. Police initially considered the possibility that Corrie had stayed with friends, become disoriented, slept somewhere unusual, or travelled elsewhere without informing anybody. But one detail kept drawing investigators back towards the centre of Bury St Edmunds, the Horseshoe. The more detectives reviewed CCTV footage, the stranger the timeline became. Corrie could clearly be seen entering the loading bay area shortly after 3:25 a.m. But despite extensive camera coverage around nearby streets, investigators could not conclusively identify footage showing him leaving. That absence quickly became the central mystery of the case, because if Corrie had walked out normally, where was the footage? Police began expanding the search radius around the town. Officers examined nearby roads, alleyways, parks, woodland, waterways, construction sites, abandoned areas, and possible accident locations. Specialist teams were brought in. Search dogs combed through undergrowth. Volunteers joined organised searches across Suffolk. Meanwhile, the media attention intensified. National newspapers began covering the story daily. Television news reports focused heavily on the baffling CCTV mystery. A young RAF gunner had apparently disappeared in one of the most monitored parts of town, and the public became obsessed with solving it. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some theories were grounded in the known evidence, others became increasingly extreme. One major theory suggested Corrie had been abducted after leaving the Horseshoe unseen. People questioned whether CCTV coverage contained blind spots, footage had been missed, or cameras had failed at a critical moment. Others believed he may have accepted a lift from somebody. Corrie had been heavily intoxicated. Friends later acknowledged he was vulnerable that night, and investigators examined whether he could have entered a vehicle voluntarily before coming to harm elsewhere. At this stage, police had not ruled out third-party involvement. That is important, because later public memory of the case sometimes makes it seem as though investigators immediately focused on the bin lorry theory. They didn't. In the early weeks, detectives explored multiple possibilities simultaneously, including assault, accidental death, voluntary disappearance, and abduction. Former Metropolitan Police Detective Colin Sutton would later publicly question aspects of the investigation, suggesting it remained possible another person had been involved. Those comments added further fuel to public debate. Meanwhile, investigators also began analysing Corrie's mobile phone activity, and what they discovered would slowly begin changing the direction of the entire case. Because although Corrie himself had disappeared, his phone appeared to continue moving after he entered the Horseshoe. Phone mast data showed the device travelling away from Bury St Edmunds during the early hours of the morning, not slowly, not randomly, but along a route consistent with a moving vehicle. That revelation immediately transformed the investigation, because now police faced an entirely new question. If Corrie had vanished on foot, why was his phone travelling across Suffolk? Investigators examined taxis, private vehicles, bus routes, delivery vans, and commercial traffic operating in the area overnight. Eventually, their attention settled on something almost nobody outside the investigation had considered: a commercial waste collection lorry. The route travelled by Corrie's phone appeared to closely match the movements of a Biffa refuse truck operating in Bury St Edmunds during the early morning hours after Corrie disappeared. At first, the theory sounded almost impossible. Police began examining whether Corrie could somehow have entered one of the industrial bins inside the Horseshoe area. Perhaps to rest, perhaps while heavily intoxicated, perhaps without fully understanding where he was. But there was a major problem, one that initially appeared to weaken the entire theory. Weight records from the refuse lorry suggested the bin involved had contained only a small amount of waste, far too little. Investigators believed to include the body of an adult man weighing around 90 kilos. And so, despite the strange phone data, the investigation remained divided between competing possibilities. Had Corrie somehow left the Horseshoe unseen? Had somebody picked him up? Was the phone travelling separately from him? Or had investigators just stumbled onto the beginning of a horrifying explanation nobody wanted to believe? As the days passed, investigators continued rebuilding Corrie McKeague's final known movements, minute by minute. Every camera angle, every witness statement, every possible route out of Bury St Edmunds. But the deeper detectives looked, the more unusual the case became. Because while Corrie himself had seemingly vanished, his mobile phone had not. Phone data suggested the device remained active after Corrie entered the Horseshoe loading area. Then sometime later, the signal began moving away from the town centre. Not in the pattern of somebody walking, not stopping at pubs, houses or taxi ranks, but travelling steadily along roads leading away from Bury St Edmunds in the early hours of the morning. Investigators began comparing the phone movement against vehicles operating nearby that night. Eventually, one route appeared to align almost perfectly. A commercial refuse lorry collecting waste from Bury St Edmunds. The possibilities sounded surreal. Even experienced investigators reportedly struggled with the idea at first. Could Corrie have climbed into one of the large industrial bins inside the Horseshoe area? Perhaps to shelter from the cold, perhaps while drunk and disoriented, perhaps intending only to rest for a few minutes. It was not as implausible as some initially believed. Evidence later emerged that Corrie had previously slept in bins after nights out. Friends described him as impulsive, and heavily intoxicated behaviour that night was already well established. Still, the theory immediately faced criticism because investigators initially believed the numbers didn't add up. Waste records suggested the relevant bin weighed only around 11 to 15 kilograms when emptied into the refuse truck. That figure appeared devastating for the theory. Corrie himself weighed far more than that. If the recorded weight was accurate, then he could not realistically have been inside the container when it was collected, and because of that, the investigation remained uncertain. Police continued examining alternative explanations. Searches expanded, witness appeals intensified, and public speculation became increasingly chaotic online. Some people became convinced Corrie had been murdered. Others believed police were focusing too heavily on the bin theory while ignoring possible suspects. Conspiracy theories spread rapidly across Facebook groups and internet forums. Meanwhile, Corrie's family were living through an unimaginable nightmare. Every new headline brought fresh hope, or fresh fear. His mother, Nicola, became one of the most visible faces of the campaign to find him. Television interviews, public appeals, social media campaigns, volunteer searches, the case became national news. And yet, despite all the attention, there was still no confirmed sighting of Corrie after 3:25 a.m. Then investigators made a discovery that changed everything. The weight data from the refuse lorry had been wrong. Police later revealed the original figures provided during the investigation were inaccurate. The actual recorded weight linked to the collection route was not around 11 kilograms, but approximately 116. Suddenly, the bin lorry theory no longer looked impossible. It looked terrifyingly plausible. That single correction transformed the direction of the case almost overnight, because now investigators believed the additional weight could potentially account for Corrie himself, plus the commercial waste already inside the container. And with that revelation, police publicly shifted toward a conclusion many people had struggled to accept. They believed Corrie McKeague had likely entered a commercial waste bin inside the Horseshoe loading area before being unknowingly collected by the refuse lorry during its early morning rounds. The implications were horrific, because if investigators were right, Corrie may already have been transported to landfill before anyone even realised he was missing. And now, the investigation was racing against time. Once investigators accepted the possibility that Corrie McKeague had been transported inside a refuse lorry, the search operation changed immediately. This was no longer simply a missing person inquiry centred around Bury St Edmunds. Now police believed Corrie may have been carried miles away from the town before sunrise, mixed into industrial waste, and dumped somewhere inside a massive landfill site. The destination linked to the refuse route was the Milton landfill site near Cambridge, a huge waste processing area receiving tons of rubbish every day. If Corrie was there, investigators knew time was becoming critical. Every new delivery of waste made recovery harder. Every passing day increased the complexity of the search. And so one of the largest landfill search operations in modern British policing history began. Specialist teams were deployed to the site. Heavy machinery was brought in. Protective suits, excavation equipment, search coordinators, forensic specialists, all working among mountains of decomposing refuse. The conditions were brutal. Search teams faced dangerous gases, unstable waste piles, contaminated material, crushing machinery, and overwhelming physical conditions. But despite the scale of the operation, police still had no certainty Corrie was actually there. That uncertainty would become one of the defining tensions of the entire case, because although the bin theory now appeared plausible, there was still no direct proof, no eyewitness, no camera footage showing Corrie entering a bin, no forensic evidence conclusively placing him inside the refuse lorry. Only a growing chain of circumstantial evidence: the CCTV timeline, the phone movement, the lorry route, the corrected weight data, and the absence of evidence showing Corrie leaving the Horseshoe area alive. Public opinion became sharply divided. Some people accepted the police explanation, others remained deeply sceptical. Critics questioned whether investigators had become too focused on a single theory. Online discussions grew increasingly hostile. Rumours spread constantly, and every new development was dissected across social media. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on Corrie's family was becoming devastating. His mother continued publicly challenging parts of the investigation at various stages. The relationship between the family and Suffolk police sometimes became strained as disagreements emerged over evidence and conclusions. At the same time, supporters across the country rallied behind the search effort. Volunteer groups organised public searches. Posters carrying Corrie's photograph appeared across towns and cities. Online campaigns attempted to keep the case in national attention. One of the most visible support movements became known as Corrie's Army, a huge online community following developments in real time and assisting with appeals. But beneath the public activity, the reality investigators faced inside the landfill was grim. Search teams were combing through thousands upon thousands of tons of waste. Everything had to be examined carefully. The process was painfully slow and physically exhausting. Weeks turned into months. Still, nothing was found. No clothing, no remains, no personal belongings conclusively linked to Corrie. And that absence created a difficult question. If police were right, why was there no trace of him? Some investigators argued the conditions inside modern industrial waste systems could explain it. Compaction mechanisms inside refuse lorries exert enormous force. Landfill movement shifts material constantly. Waste can be spread, buried, compressed, and contaminated rapidly. But for many observers, the lack of recovery kept doubt alive, because psychologically, people often struggle to accept a death without physical evidence. Eventually, after months of searching and enormous financial cost, the landfill operation was suspended. Police had examined more than 6,500 tonnes of waste. The search cost exceeded £2 million. And yet, despite one of the largest operations of its kind ever attempted in Britain, Corrie McKeague was still missing. No final proof had been uncovered, no body had been recovered, and the central mystery still remained unresolved in the minds of many people following the case. But investigators themselves were becoming increasingly convinced they already knew what had happened. The question now was whether the public and Corrie's family would ever fully accept that conclusion. As the landfill search came to an end, the investigation into Corrie McKeague entered a new phase. The frantic urgency of the early months began fading into something slower, heavier, and far more emotionally complicated. Because although Corrie had still not been found, Suffolk police were now speaking with increasing confidence about what they believed had happened during his final hours. Investigators stated publicly that after reviewing CCTV footage, mobile phone data, waste collection routes, timing evidence, and the corrected weight information from the refuse lorry, they believed the most likely explanation was that Corrie had entered a commercial waste bin voluntarily while intoxicated. According to the police theory, Corrie had likely climbed into the container inside the Horseshoe area sometime after 3:25 a.m, possibly to sleep, possibly to shelter from the cold after drinking heavily throughout the night. Then, during routine waste collection rounds, the bin was emptied mechanically into the refuse lorry. Investigators believed Corrie was either asleep, unconscious, or too disoriented to react before the crushing mechanism activated. The theory was horrifyingly precise because of how ordinary it sounded. No elaborate conspiracy, no hidden killer, no dramatic abduction, just a sequence of tragic events unfolding silently in the early hours of the morning while the town slept. But despite police confidence, public doubt did not disappear. Critics continued raising questions about CCTV coverage. Could Corrie still have exited the Horseshoe unseen? Had every camera angle truly been checked? Could the phone have travelled separately from him? Others questioned whether investigators had become locked into one explanation too early. The case became a frequent subject of online debate, and because no remains were ever recovered, those doubts never fully vanished. Meanwhile, the emotional reality for Corrie's family remained devastatingly unresolved. His mother, Nicola, continued speaking publicly about concerns surrounding aspects of the investigation. At points she challenged police assumptions and questioned whether alternative possibilities had been explored fully enough. The relationship between grieving families and investigators in long-running missing person cases is often incredibly complex, especially when there is no body, no funeral, no final certainty, because psychologically, ambiguity can keep hope alive long after evidence points elsewhere. And for Corrie's loved ones, that ambiguity became part of everyday life. While the public discussion continued, other painful developments were also unfolding privately. Corrie's girlfriend, April Oliver, later gave birth to their daughter after his disappearance, a child Corrie would never meet. For many people following the case, that detail brought a heartbreaking human reality to a story often dominated by forensic discussion and investigative theory. Years passed, but officially, Corrie McKeague remained a missing person. Then in 2022, almost 6 years after he vanished, the case entered its final major legal stage, the inquest. An inquest jury heard extensive evidence surrounding Corrie's movements, alcohol consumption, CCTV analysis, phone data, waste collection systems, and the landfill search. The hearing examined the mechanics of commercial refuse collection in disturbing detail. Jurors heard how somebody inside a commercial waste container could realistically remain unseen during routine collection rounds. They also heard evidence that Corrie had previously slept in bins after nights out. Ultimately, the jury reached a conclusion consistent with the police theory investigators had spent years defending. They concluded that Corrie McKeague died after entering a commercial waste bin before being collected by a refuse lorry. His cause of death was recorded as compression asphyxia in association with multiple injuries. The inquest also concluded that alcohol impairment contributed significantly to the events leading to his death. In addition, the jury criticised aspects of commercial waste collection safety, including issues involving bin security, visibility checks, and collection procedures. Legally, The inquest brought the case to a conclusion, but emotionally, for many people, the mystery never entirely ended. Because despite years of investigation, despite one of the largest landfill searches in British history, despite a formal inquest conclusion, there was still one haunting reality nobody could escape. Corrie McKeague was never found. There are some cases that remain famous because of violence, others because of the people involved, others because of shocking discoveries. But the disappearance of Corrie McKeague unsettled Britain for a different reason. Because at its centre, it presented something people struggled deeply to accept. The idea that somebody can simply disappear during an ordinary night out in the middle of a modern town, without anyone truly understanding what happened until it may already be too late. The case also exposed how quickly mystery grows in the absence of certainty. In the early days after Corrie vanished, theories spread faster than facts. Online discussions turned into accusations. Speculation became entertainment for some people watching from a distance. And as often happens in high-profile missing persons cases, the line between investigation and public obsession became increasingly blurred. But beneath all the debate, all the theories, all the headlines, there remained a real person, a son, a friend, a father who never got to meet his daughter. And perhaps that is what makes the case so emotionally difficult years later. Because unlike many investigations, there was never a final discovery that allowed people to emotionally process what happened. No recovery, no funeral in the traditional sense, no definitive final moment. Only evidence, probability, and a conclusion many people accept, while others still question. Even now, some continue to believe Corrie left the Horseshoe area alive. Others remain convinced somebody else was involved, and because no direct proof was ever recovered, those questions will probably never disappear completely. But investigators themselves remain consistent in their final position. They believed Corrie's death was a tragic accident caused by intoxication, a sequence of ordinary events leading to irreversible consequences. An exhausted young man, a dark loading bay, a commercial waste bin, and a routine refuse collection nobody noticed at the time. If that theory is correct, then one of Britain's most haunting modern disappearances happened silently, without witnesses, without intent, and without anyone realising the truth until long afterwards. And perhaps that possibility is more frightening to many people than any elaborate conspiracy could ever be, because sometimes what they hide is not a secret carefully buried by somebody dangerous. Sometimes it is the terrifying reality that tragedy can unfold in complete darkness, while the rest of the world carries on unaware. That's where we're going to leave today's episode. If you've listened all the way through, thank you. A huge thank you as always to everybody supporting the show, sharing episodes, and helping the podcast continue to grow. Shout out this week to Jamie in Newcastle, Hannah from Cardiff, Lewis in Aberdeen, and Megan over in Cork. Thank you all for listening and supporting the podcast. You can find the show on all socials at What They Hide Pod, and if you'd like to support the podcast directly, the Buy Me a Coffee link is available in the episode description. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following or subscribed so you don't miss future releases. Because next time, we examine another case, another hidden truth, and another story somebody hoped would never fully come to light. But for now, this is where the story ends.